The rustling of leaves and the rhythmic crunch of boots against damp earth filled the air as the soldier moved cautiously through the dense forest. It was another routine patrol, another long stretch of silence interrupted only by the occasional distant call of birds. His rifle hung securely at his side, his eyes scanning the surroundings for anything unusual. But deep in the wilderness, nothing ever truly felt ordinary. Then he heard it. Soft, barely perceptible at first, a faint rustling behind him, like something small moving through the underbrush. His muscles tensed as he instinctively reached for his weapon, his senses sharpening. He turned, expecting to see a stray fox or maybe a deer startled by his presence. Instead, standing a few paces away was a tiny bear cub. It was no more than a few months old, its fur a mix of dark brown and golden hues, its small black eyes staring up at him. The soldier's first thought was immediate and instinctual. Where is its mother? A lone bear cub was never a good sign. If the mother was nearby, she would see his presence as a threat. And if she wasn't, something was very wrong. Ignoring the animal, the soldier turned back around and resumed walking. He had no business with wildlife, and the last thing he needed was an encounter with a protective mother bear. He picked up his pace, keeping his mind on the mission. But after only a few steps, he heard it again. That same rustling, the sound of small paws trudging through leaves. The cub was following him. The soldier frowned. He tried quickening his steps, making his way through a cluster of thick trees, expecting the little creature to lose interest. But when he glanced over his shoulder, there it was, trotting along, struggling to keep up with his long strides. Annoyance flickered through him. He turned and waved a hand. "Go on, get out of here," he muttered under his breath, shooing the cub away. The bear blinked but didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him, unafraid. The soldier exhaled sharply. This wasn't normal. Animals had instincts, fear of humans, fear of danger. A cub this young should have been skittish, hesitant to approach, but this one, it was desperate. His brows furrowed as he took a closer look. The cub's fur was slightly matted, dirt clinging to its small body as if it had been wandering for days. Its ears twitched, and it let out a soft whimper, glancing behind it toward the thick darkness of the trees. It wasn't just following him, it wanted something. A strange feeling settled in the soldier's gut. He had seen wounded animals before, but this was different. The cub wasn't running in fear. It was seeking help. For the first time, he hesitated. Something in the way the cub looked at him, those round, pleading eyes, the subtle trembling of its tiny frame, made him pause. A wave of unease washed over him. Something was wrong, and despite every logical reason to walk away, the soldier found himself unable to ignore it. He wasn't just being followed, he was being led. The soldier stood still, his heart pounding slightly as he studied the bear cub in front of him. The little creature wasn't just following him out of curiosity. There was a clear desperation in its movements, an urgency that gnawed at his instincts. He crouched down slowly, keeping his hands on his knees, careful not to make any sudden movements. The cub took a few hesitant steps forward, its tiny claws barely making a sound against the damp earth. Up close, the soldier could see just how much distress it was in. Its fur, which should have been thick and glossy, was matted with dirt and debris. Its small body looked frail, not plump and well-fed like a healthy cub should be. Its sides rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths, and every few moments it swayed slightly, as if struggling to stay upright. The soldier frowned. This cub was weak, hungry, exhausted. The little bear lifted its head and let out a small, pitiful sound, half whimper, half groan. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't afraid, it was pleading. The soldier's training told him not to interfere. Wild animals survived on their own, it wasn't his place to intervene. But his instincts told him otherwise. The cub was in trouble, that much was clear. And even more unsettling, it wasn't just wandering aimlessly. The soldier followed its gaze as it turned toward the thick shadows of the forest. Its round, dark eyes darted back and forth, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the trees. Was it searching for its mother? The thought sent a fresh wave of tension through him. If the mother bear was nearby, this was dangerous. But if she wasn't, why was the cub alone? A sinking feeling settled in his chest. He had heard stories before, of poachers, of injured animals left to fend for themselves. The forest was unpredictable, a place where nature's rules often clashed with human cruelty. He looked back at the cub, who had now sunk to its belly, panting lightly, its small frame trembling. It had been walking for a long time, too long. The soldier clenched his jaw. He could keep walking, pretend he never saw it. That would be the easy choice. But as he watched the cub struggle to lift its head, something inside him refused to let him turn away. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, little one," he muttered, even though he knew the bear wouldn't understand. "Let's see what you're trying to show me." The cub let out another soft whimper, lifting itself onto unsteady paws. It blinked up at him, then turned back toward the trees, glancing over its shoulder as if to make sure he was following. The soldier took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Against every logical instinct, he adjusted his rifle, steadied his footing, and stepped forward. Something told him this cub story wasn't just about survival, it was about something much bigger. And whatever it was, he was about to find out. The soldier barely had time to process his decision before he felt a small, insistent tug on his pant leg. He looked down to see the cub pawing at the fabric, its tiny claws clutching at the material as if urging him forward. He hesitated. He wasn't supposed to be here, following a wild animal into the unknown, stepping off the path he'd carefully memorized. His training told him to stay on course, to report anything unusual and move on. But this wasn't just unusual, it was a silent plea. The cub whined softly, then turned, its little legs moving clumsily but determinedly through the undergrowth. It took a few steps and stopped, glancing back at him expectantly. The message was clear. "Follow me." The soldier let out a slow breath, then adjusted his rifle. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. He should have walked away. He should have ignored this. But something about the way the cub moved, driven, desperate, made it impossible. Reluctantly, he took a step forward, then another. The cub perked up and continued deeper into the trees, leading him away from the familiar trail. The deeper they went, the thicker the underbrush became. Branches clawed at his uniform, the damp scent of moss and earth filling his nostrils. The canopy above grew denser, blocking out much of the light. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees, their shapes shifting with each step. The soldier's grip on his rifle tightened. This part of the forest was unfamiliar. It was wild, untouched by human presence, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But the cub pressed on, its small body pushing past ferns and tangled roots, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Every so often, it would glance back, making sure he was still following. The soldier's breathing was steady, but inside, a different kind of tension had begun to build. Something about this didn't feel right. He had been in the wilderness long enough to recognize the signs of unease. The way the birds had gone silent, the absence of any rustling from smaller animals that should have been scurrying through the undergrowth. The forest was too quiet. His instincts were screaming at him, telling him this wasn't just a simple case of a lost cub. Something had happened here. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he stepped over a fallen log, his eyes scanning for any movement beyond the cub. The further they went, the stronger the sense of urgency became. Not his own, but the cub's. It wasn't wandering, it wasn't lost. It was leading him to something. A fresh chill ran down his spine. He had no idea what he was about to find, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary rescue. The soldier pressed forward, his steps slow and deliberate as he followed the cub deeper into the woods. The dense foliage began to thin, revealing glimpses of an open space ahead. The air felt heavier now, thick with an eerie stillness that sent a chill through his spine. Then the cub suddenly stopped, its small body tensed, ears flicking forward as it let out a low whimper. The soldier's gaze followed its line of sight, and that's when he saw it. Just beyond the trees, in the middle of a small clearing, lay a massive, motionless shape. His breath caught in his throat, the mother bear. For a moment he didn't move, he barely breathed. The cub, however, wasted no time. Letting out a desperate cry, it stumbled forward, its tiny paws digging into the dirt as it rushed to her side. It nuzzled against her thick fur, pawing at her face, trying to wake her. But she didn't move. The soldier's chest tightened as he took a cautious step forward, keeping his rifle slung over his shoulder. Even in this vulnerable state, an injured bear was still dangerous. But as he drew closer, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. She was still alive, but barely. Her breaths were weak and labored, her sides rising and falling with painful slowness. Her body was covered in dirt and leaves, as if she had collapsed here hours ago. But it wasn't just exhaustion that had brought her down. Then he saw it, a deep wound just above her front leg. The flesh was torn and raw, dark with dried blood and fresh with infection. The soldier felt his jaw clench. He had seen injuries like this before. Poacher trap. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a mother bear who had fallen ill. She had been caught, likely struggling for hours, maybe days, before finally freeing herself, but at a terrible cost. And all the while, her cub had been watching. His gaze shifted to the little one, who was still nudging its mother, still refusing to accept what was happening. The cub let out a high-pitched whine, then rubbed its head against her fur as if begging her to wake up. The soldier swallowed hard. He had been trained to keep his emotions in check, to assess situations with logic, not feeling. But this was different. This cub hadn't just been lost. It had been on a mission. It had braved the vast, unpredictable wilderness, tracking down the only thing it thought could help him. And now, standing here, witnessing the heartbreaking reality of what the cub had fought so hard to escape, the weight of it all crushed him. His fingers curled into fists. The cub never stood a chance on its own. If its mother didn't survive, neither would it. He took a slow, steady inhale and forced himself to push aside the emotions clawing at his chest. There was no time to feel, only time to act. If he didn't do something now, this would turn into a tragedy. The soldier's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. His voice was steady, but urgency laced every word as he called for support. He requested a wildlife rescue team, emphasizing the critical condition of the injured mother bear. But the response that crackled back sent a cold wave through him. There were no specialists nearby. The closest team was hours away, maybe longer. He stared at the mother bear, watching as her shallow breaths grew weaker. The cub whimpered beside her, its small head resting against her massive frame. There was no time to wait. If he walked away now, the bear wouldn't survive, and the cub would be left alone to a fate just as cruel. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him. He had no medical training for animals, no supplies beyond what he carried for himself. But he had seen wounds before. He had treated soldiers in the field with nothing but instinct and sheer will. He had two options: watch her die, or try to save her with what little he had. He chose the latter. Moving cautiously, he approached the mother bear, his boots pressing lightly into the damp earth. She didn't stir at first. Her body was limp, her strength nearly gone. But as he knelt beside her, he saw her ear twitch slightly, a faint response to his presence. She was still in there, still fighting. The soldier pulled a small first aid kit from his pack. It was meant for human injuries, but right now, it was all he had. He retrieved a sterile cloth, his fingers steady as he reached toward the gaping wound on her leg. Dried blood caked the fur, and the raw edges of the injury were inflamed. Infection had already begun to set in. He worked quickly, dabbing the wound with water from his canteen, washing away the grime. The bear flinched slightly, a low rumble escaping her throat. Instinct told him to back away, to remember that this was a wild animal. But another instinct, one stronger, told him to keep going. He could see the cub watching him closely, its round, dark eyes filled with uncertainty. As gently as possible, he pressed a bandage against the wound, securing it with strips of cloth he tore from his own sleeve. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to what a professional would do, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then, just as he was beginning to fear the worst, the mother bear stirred. It was a small movement, barely more than a shift of her massive paw, but it sent a surge of hope through the soldier's chest. The cub lifted its head, letting out a tiny, hopeful cry. The bear's eyes opened slightly, not fully, not with strength, but enough to see her cub, enough to know she wasn't alone. The soldier exhaled sharply, wiping sweat from his brow. Relief was brief, though, because reality crashed back down on him with full force. This wasn't over. The bear was still gravely injured, still fighting for every breath. If he didn't get her proper medical help soon, all of this would have been for nothing. His mind raced through the possibilities. The rescue team was too far. Carrying a full-grown bear was impossible. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Determination hardened in his chest. He had come too far to let this end here. One way or another, he was getting this bear to safety. The soldier knew the risk he was about to take, but there was no other choice. The mother bear was still alive, but she wouldn't be for long if she stayed here. He couldn't just leave her. Not after everything the cub had endured to find help. The only option left was to get her back to his outpost, no matter how impossible it seemed. He quickly scanned his surroundings, thinking fast. There was no way he could carry the massive animal on his own. But if he could build something sturdy enough to drag her, he might have a chance. His hands moved instinctively, pulling branches from the forest floor, weaving them together with rope from his gear. He laid his jacket over the frame, creating a surface that would at least provide some support. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The real challenge came next. With careful movements, he positioned himself next to the bear, wary of how she might react. Though weakened, she was still a wild animal. A single burst of panic could spell disaster. He reached out, pressing a firm but cautious hand against her fur. She let out a low groan but didn't fight him. Her body was too drained, her breathing still shallow. Using all the strength he had, the soldier maneuvered her onto the makeshift stretcher. His muscles burned with the effort. The cub let out a distressed whimper, circling her mother, nudging her with its nose as if trying to help. Once she was in place, he took hold of the rope and began pulling. The weight was staggering. Even in her weakened state, the mother bear was enormous, her massive frame nearly too much for the crude stretcher to handle. Every step forward was a battle, his boots digging into the soft earth, his arms straining against the burden. The cub trotted alongside them, refusing to leave its mother's side. Every few minutes, it nudged her face as if reminding her to stay awake, to keep fighting. The soldier knew the truth. She was barely hanging on. The journey back was grueling. Every inch of progress felt agonizingly slow. The forest, once just an expanse of trees and shadows, now felt like an endless maze designed to test his endurance. His breath came in short bursts, his muscles screaming in protest. But he didn't stop. The further they went, the more his fear grew. Was he too late? Was she slipping away? With every painful moment that passed, he could feel his own pulse pounding in his ears, each beat a reminder that time was running out. He pushed forward, ignoring the ache in his body, ignoring the doubt creeping into his mind. He wasn't just carrying the bear, he was carrying the cub's last hope, and he would not let it die here. The soldier's legs burned with exhaustion, his grip on the makeshift stretcher slick with sweat. But he refused to slow down. The weight of the injured bear dragged against the forest floor, each step forward a battle against his own body's limits. The cub stayed close, whimpering softly, its eyes flickering between the soldier and its mother, as if it understood that her life depended on this man's strength. Then, through the thinning trees, the outpost came into view. Relief surged through him, but there was no time to celebrate. He let out a sharp, urgent call, and within seconds, his fellow soldiers emerged from the main building. Their faces were a mix of confusion and alarm as they rushed toward him, their boots kicking up dirt as they realized what he had done. "We need to stabilize her," the soldier barked, his voice hoarse from exertion. No one questioned him. Years of training had taught them to act first, ask later. Together they lifted the mother bear with careful precision, transferring her from the crude stretcher onto a larger, more stable surface. A medic, trained for humans but adaptable in emergencies, assessed the wound, nodding grimly. "She's in bad shape, but she's still got a chance," he muttered. "We need to keep her calm until the rescue team gets here." The soldier stepped back, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. His body screamed for rest, but his eyes stayed locked on the mother bear. She was still alive, but barely. The cub let out a distressed cry, pressing its small body against her side. Minutes stretched into an agonizing wait. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. The wildlife rescue team had arrived. A wave of relief crashed over the soldier as the professionals leaped into action. Medics and specialized gear surrounded the bear, checking her vitals, administering fluids, and carefully inspecting the wound. The soldier watched as they worked with practiced efficiency, their movements precise and full of purpose. "She's lucky," one of them said, glancing at the soldier. "If you hadn't gotten her here when you did, she wouldn't have made it." He exhaled sharply, his shoulders finally sagging. He had done it. He had given her a fighting chance. But even as relief settled in, so did something heavier. His gaze shifted to the cub, who remained glued to its mother's side. It hadn't once left her, not even for a second. Even now, as strangers worked around them, the cub pressed against her, as if its presence alone could keep her alive. The soldier swallowed against the tightness in his throat. He had spent years witnessing hardship, making difficult choices, and carrying burdens that most wouldn't understand. But this was different. This was raw. This was love in its purest form. He stood there for a long moment, watching as the mother bear was carefully lifted onto a transport stretcher. The rescue team would take her to a proper facility, where she could receive real treatment, where she had a chance at survival, beyond just a soldier's desperate field dressing. As they loaded her into the vehicle, the cub let out a frantic cry, scrambling to follow. One of the rescuers gently scooped it up, cradling it for reassurance. "Don't worry, little one," the man said softly. "You're going with her." The soldier closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. The tension that had wrapped around his chest for hours finally began to loosen. She was safe. The cub was safe. And for the first time since stepping off that path into the unknown, he allowed himself to believe that he had done the right thing. Days passed, and the weight of uncertainty lingered in the soldier's mind. He had done everything he could, but doubt still gnawed at him. Had the mother bear survived? Had his efforts been enough? Then one evening, a message arrived from the Wildlife Rescue Center. The mother bear had pulled through. The infection had been treated, her strength was slowly returning, and best of all, the cub never left her side. Relief washed over him, but a deeper feeling took hold. He needed to see them one last time before his deployment ended. When he arrived at the rescue center, a quiet sense of peace settled over him. The facility was nestled within the forest, a sanctuary built to heal those caught in the clash between nature and human interference. He followed one of the caretakers through a secured area, his pulse quickening with each step. Then he saw them. The mother bear, once weak and fading, now stood tall and steady within her enclosure. Her fur, though still scarred, had regained its strength. And right beside her, the cub, alert, full of energy, and unmistakably alive. The moment the cub spotted him, something incredible happened. Without hesitation, it rushed toward the fence, letting out an excited cry. Its small paws pressed against the barrier, its dark eyes wide with recognition. The soldier stood frozen, emotions catching in his throat. It remembered him. The cub, the same tiny creature that had braved the forest alone, seeking help against all odds, knew exactly who he was. The soldier took a slow step forward, kneeling in front of the fence. The cub let out a soft sound, one that wasn't a cry for help this time, but something else entirely. Gratitude. And that's when the soldier finally let go. For the first time in years, he felt his own walls crumble. His vision blurred as silent tears traced paths down his face. It wasn't just about saving a life. It was about witnessing something rare and profound, pure, unwavering love. The mother bear watched from a distance, her deep eyes calm, as if she too understood the moment. She had survived because of him. Her cub had hope because of him. As he stood, wiping his face, he knew that this experience would never leave him. He had spent his life following orders, moving from one mission to the next. But this had changed something inside him. As he walked away, the cub let out one last sound, a soft, familiar whimper, one that no longer carried desperation, only recognition. And for the first time in a long time, the soldier left with something more than duty fulfilled. He left with his heart full.